Does God care about small places? How can we faithfully serve Christ in a rural context? What is the future of the church in rural America? The Rural Ministry Podcast deals with questions like this and much more in the hopes of bringing practical resources and inspiring stories to help the church flourish in rural communities. Dr. Charlie Cotterman is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of a rural church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. Join the conversation as we journey into the good things God is doing in small places. All right, and welcome to another episode of the Rural Ministry Podcast, where we talk about the unique challenges and joys of living and doing ministry in rural places. I'm your host, Garrett Heath, Director of Media and Communications at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College, and I'm joined as usual by my co-host, Dr. Charlie Cotterman. Charlie is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of Oil City Vineyard Church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. So today, we're beginning a new mini-series on probably one of the more difficult issues for those doing ministry in rural America, and that is raising up leaders. Especially in small churches, in small places, this can be a tall task. We've actually touched on some of these challenges in this regard in one of our very early episodes, but today we really hope to get practical and dive in a little bit deeper with a conversation with a guest who knows a thing or two about leadership development. With us today is Steve Donaldson. Steve is the founder of Rural Compassion, a national initiative dedicated to encouraging, strengthening, and empowering small and rural churches to work outside their four walls to address the needs of their surrounding communities. Thanks for joining us today, Steve.
Oh, man, thanks for having me. I look forward to it.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this one, Steve. I got to meet Steve last November at a Lily gathering, and I heard a little bit about your story, and I was just like, man, I have to hear more. We have to get him on the podcast. So when we thought about this leadership series, I thought this is a great way to kick it off. So I don't know, maybe the best thing to do would just be to start by hearing a little bit of your story. Maybe your personal story, and then how Rural Compassion came about, if that makes sense.
No, that's great. I love rural America. It's like one of those things God just put in my heart, and it wasn't really my plan in life. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I always thought I would work in San Francisco doing some kind of compassion work. And as God would have it, my wife and I, we planted a church and a ministry to the poor up where the Sierras meet the Cascades. And when we got up there, we just were blown away by the opportunity for the church, but also the lack of social services and how, when the church got beyond the walls of the building, it really created opportunity to have a lot of influence in our particular situation. We were very isolated and in our whole county. And but it really took intentionality and God gave us some people around us that were really connected. And but as a pastor, you're kind of the leader and you give vision and direction. And it was really in my heart to bring the compassion of Christ to that whole county and especially in the valley. And part of the whole compassion journey started, my dad was a pastor, and in 1969, 4 kids. My older brother Hal was 12, I was 10. My younger brother was 9, my sister 5, and my parents were on the way to a meeting and hit head on. My dad was killed instantly. My mom severely injured. And a family, a 10 by 50 mobile home, they took us into their home. And Talk about inconvenience. So you take
Wow.
4 children into your home that are in shock. And my mom was severely injured when she was able to get out of the hospital. They brought the hospital bed right into the living room. And, the Davis family really made a true difference in our life. And the church community as a whole came around our family and then eventually helped us get into our own home. And so, really, that incident, sometimes God takes bad things and turns them in good directions. And really is the genesis for an organization called Convoy of Hope. Um, and that's kind of myself and 2 brothers, kind of were there at the beginning to get that going. And then um, about, I had pastored in the rural setting. It really got in my heart. And I was reading Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. And he basically said, hey, find one thing to do and do it as well as you can. And it was just really had a strong impetus inside of me to put all of my efforts towards rural America. And so that
Wow.
was about 22 years ago. And really that's been 100% of my focus. And I, man, I have met I've just met some of the best people that I think that have ever lived. We read about Hudson Taylor and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but we know about Mother Teresa. But I get to meet people that, man, they are in obscurity, serving God's kingdom and making just significant difference, not just in their church, but they're bringing leadership to their community as a whole.
Yeah. Wow. I know there's more and we're going to hear about a little more of what you do, but I just want to stop and say, praise God for the way he redeemed. I mean, I I heard that story in a conversation at the gathering in November, and I was just and it came out of a lot of stories that weren't as positive about the church. And I was just like, wow, the church was the church,
Mhm.
it was just such a beautiful thing. Um, how they came around you in the midst of a tragedy that it's hard to even wrap your head around.
Wow, that's what stands out to the most to me as well. We hear all these stories about how the church kind of jades people and rubs them the wrong way. What a great story of church coming around you and your family, and we need more stories like that, right?
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
right.
our experience with the church is just incredibly healthy. And, we just, especially us 3 boys, we were into sports, and the church we attended, a smaller church, but the men just really got involved in our lives, come watch us play sports even when we weren't very good. And, that kind of investment makes an enormous difference.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Man, no wonder we're talking about leadership development here, where you're just having people invest in you, and then you've spent your life investing in others. So, tell us a little bit about what rural compassion, how you how it works, what it does, how do you find, yeah, how's that working?
So 100% of our focus are small towns, and we have a team of people that are placed all around the United States, and we work through the local church as our portal. Typically, we're targeting communities of 5,000 or less, and we really teach the pastor to help lead his church in becoming what we would call a communitarian.
Mm,
And we ask the pastor to consider investing 25% of their time in building relationships and working alongside the community leadership.
mm,
And sometimes when you initially present that, it's like, wow, I could never do that.
yeah.
Um, but when we talk about leadership, I've seen so many pastors take on this idea. Um, you go 5 years later, and a lot of the leaders that end up being in their church are those stakeholders that they've been working alongside of in the community.
Yep.
Because typically, community leaders become community leaders because they want to make a difference, and they might even have a different journey of faith than we might. But there's something about when you get in the ditches with them and you laugh with them, you cry with them, everybody needs a pastor,
Yeah.
and you become their pastor, and just over time, you'll see not only them as an individual, but their leadership and their resources a lot of times added to your church body.
Yeah.
But it's not with what we do, we haven't really seen a quick fix anywhere.
Right.
Slow is fast.
Mm-hmm.
And in the rural setting, you try to go fast and you'll scare people to death.
Yeah.
And our portal entry point is ministry happens at the speed of relationships.
Mm.
And so, it's super important that pastors are trained in seminary, and but it's also vital that you got to be a people person.
Mm.
And if you're not, and you're shy, well, part of your calling is going to change that, because you got to step beyond that and really, get in the community. And when I talk about stakeholders, I'm talking business owners, I'm talking fire chief, police chief, superintendent of schools, the individual who is the head of the social workers, the health department, if there's a local clinic or hospital, if there's a prominent family, you want to be at the table with them, just to really help your community be a place where we can see children and families flourish, and together we can link arms. And if the issue is economic and it's just a weak economy in our area, maybe together we can make a difference there. And I know that might not be typical pastor responsibilities, but really, if we're pastoring a community and we're going to pastor the whole town, anything that happens in that community is my responsibility.
Yeah. That's
And
so good. I mean, we haven't even got into the specific leadership questions yet, but honestly, there's so much about leadership that we just covered in this. I remember that when you said that about the 25% out in the community, that spurs something in my memory of a conversation we had where you kind of gave us the breakdown of what you encourage your pastors, right? You have a basic weekly breakdown, if I remember right, of percentages of time that you encourage them to spend in certain ways. Is that right?
yeah, for sure. And, a group that's been doing it for 75 years, Village Mission, if you're a missionary with them, they want you to spend 50% in
Okay.
the community, and, they have a long history of doing incredible work in small communities. We asked the pastor to consider spending 25% of their time on their homily preps, and to be really a spiritual person themselves. And then 25% caring for their congregation, church governance, setting out vision, 25% raising up leaders. Many of our rural churches, most of the work is done by the pastor's family, and one other family.
Hmm.
And if we don't raise up additional leaders, we're never going to raise up additional capacity to serve in greater ways and build God's kingdom in greater ways. And then 25% with community leaders. And part of that community leader, you want to be connected with all the main leaders in your town, but also certain pastors, they might have a background in medical, they might have a background as a farmer. They maybe were an engineer prior to, becoming a pastor. Whatever those gift sets are come into play on where, maybe they can serve the community in the best
Yeah.
manner.
I love that. So the intentionality, and I think that's something that I don't think I took for that I really understood coming out of seminary or even starting a church. And my hunch is that a lot of pastors don't think about their schedule with that kind of intentionality, that there are these certain things that are going to help, especially in a small town, me be able to pastor not just this church, not just myself and my family, but this town. And it's going to involve like an intentionality around my schedule, because a lot of people they don't think about the importance of connecting with community leaders. I just came from, right before this, I had a ministerium Christmas meeting. Like we started with some business, which actually is going to really help our town. It was some aid to the local service agency that we can provide. And then we had a Christmas party, right? It was a lot of fun, but I mean, we get a third of the pastors in that because people just don't see the value in connecting in your community, whether it's other pastors or business leaders. And I'm 100% with you that, if you want to reach a small place, you got to work with the leaders in that place.
For sure. It is vital, and to work with the other churches.
Mm-hmm.
It's C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, towards the end of that writing, he said one sign of maturity of the Christian faith is when we work together. And, some of we all have our distinctives, but, we're unified in the person of Christ, and that Christ is what brings us salvation. And there's more that we are unified in than have differences many times. And, it's important for pastors to take leadership in that as well, and build those relationships. Super important. That whole relational component is just, it's important within your church body. It's important really at all levels of leadership, for our church. And it's, one thing about a small town is, they want leadership to come from local people. And a friend of mine, he had a pair of jeans, the ones with the holes and frays, and he goes out of town for the weekend. He comes back, his 86-year-old grandmother had taken those jeans. She cut off all the frays and patched up all the holes. Made changes you weren't supposed to make. And if outside people come in and they're going to be the ones who give leadership to the community, a lot of times they're going to make changes that are not supposed to be made. They don't know the interpersonal relationships. They don't know the history of the community. And it really positions the church to be one that coalesces people and really sets a vision beyond maybe what the community, presently has.
Well, what I like about this conversation already out of the gate too is I think one of the reasons why it's such a challenge when pastors think about raising up leaders, like if we're only looking within our own four walls, right? It's no wonder that can be an overwhelming concept, right? So like immediately you've kind of just blown that out of the water, Steve, by making this relational and not rocket science either.
Yeah.
But getting out into the community, right? For sure.
Yeah.
100%. Well, that might be a good jumping off point to ask you a couple of these questions I have around leadership, and we'll get to this idea of raising up leaders and developing leaders that we do have in a minute. And this is kind of, you've been talking about this, so maybe you can just crystallize it in a few takeaways for us. But when you think about the biggest lessons you've learned about leading in rural communities and small towns, I'd be curious to know what they are. I think one off the top is going to be relational. It's relational. But yeah, if you could just talk to us a little bit about what have you learned about what it takes to be a leader in a small place?
One is longevity. It just, this isn't the kind of calling where you can go in for 2 years and then leave and go somewhere else. It takes a while for most small communities to accept you, and most congregations to accept you. And, it's, you really need to make a long-term commitment. There's a gentleman, Dr. John Perkins, who really was a leader in Christian community development. He basically says, if you're not going for 15 years, do not go. And, that doesn't mean you can't do good work in 5 years, but his point is it just takes time.
Yeah.
And, D.L. Moody said you can never overstate the value of presence. And, so just that is just a really an essential part of it. I think it's super important that as pastors we're learners,
Mm.
and if we want to be a leader, I mean, there's so many great leadership books out there, and like right now I'm reading a book, Emotional Intelligence, written a long time ago and rewritten, and we have to just keep growing. And if we run into a leader in the community and they have a special understanding of history or something like that, you know what? We got two ears and one mouth. Let's be a listener. Let's show interest in what their passion is. So,
Mhm.
um, Pastor Charlie, what else? I kind of lost my train there a little
Yeah,
bit.
no, we're just talking about what you've learned about leading in small places, but I think that's all really good stuff. I mean, that idea of really listening and staying, like those are actually both postures of attentiveness, and faithful presence. Those are values that are very close to our hearts here at the Center for Rural Ministry, close to my heart personally, because so many times in small places, churches are used to being stepping stone churches, where the person, straight out of seminary, will like, we'll let you try it out here. But then, like, it's built like a professional organization where the only way to get your increases in whatever, and, you don't begrudge the pastors necessarily because they got to take care of their families. But so many of these small churches are like have PTSD from pastors leaving them
Yeah,
so quickly, and you feel like no one ever wants to stay, right? So just simply the value of saying, no, we have put down roots, we care about this place, we're going to stay with you through thick and thin. That speaks love, and you can lead out of that kind of love.
yeah, very, very important. And it for me, I grew up in the city, and then I'm going to rural. It's a much different culture for me. And so, like where we were at, where the Sierras meet the Cascades, they had a lot of cowboys. So I became friends with a cowboy boss and just intentionally asked him about culture so I could understand the cowboy community. Then I became friends with a rancher because ranchers are a whole different world than the cowboys. We had a prison, so I got to know some correctional officers and tried to learn about their culture.
Mm-hmm.
And then, just building relationships with people who had lived in the community for many years and just trying, assuming I didn't understand the culture,
Yeah.
and
Well, and I'll just say something to that. What's beautiful about that, because you just spoke about the importance of being a lifelong learner. But the other thing that you haven't said, but that I hear all through this story, is being a lifelong learner who is humble, right? And those actually go together because you can't really want to learn unless you know you need to learn. You're missing something you want to learn. But when you say, I went and I just asked them a question, what's this culture like? That, like, there are pastors out there, and most of us have this temptation. Oh, I don't want to ask that question because it'll make me look like I don't know something. It'll make me look like I have some lack. I want to look confident. I want to look like I'm in control of the situation. But no, like, we simply don't know the cultures that we show up in unless we spend time asking good questions, getting to know people. And even if it's a place like where I'm at, I mean, I'm 20 minutes from where I grew up. But in some
hmm,
sense, this town is very different, has a different story than the little town I grew up in. And one of the first things I did when I got to town was I called the superintendent. I cold called him and said, tell me about your town. And we got together and we became good friends. 6 months later, he's in our church, right? But like, we became great friends, and he just gave me a tour. And it was the best thing I could have possibly done.
wow, that's for us. That's a big thing. We teach pastors 3 years to become the best friend of the public school system.
Yep.
And part of that idea in a rural town, many times the strongest or the main hub is the school system.
Yeah.
And, but not to come into the school system like, well, we're the church and we have the answer, coming into the school system with humility, saying, hey, we don't know how we can serve. We just really want to help you reach your goals. And whatever we do, we want it to be something that is actually beneficial to the students, to the leadership of the school, and to the parents. And we found that to have John 15:16 talks about fruit that remains.
Mm.
We have seen so much fruit that remains just from serving the school system. And we all care about kids being good citizens, being able to read, write, and be good at arithmetic, and we a lot of times rural teachers, their pay is different than sometimes in suburbia. And just being a support makes an enormous difference. One thing that I also in leadership is sometimes, at least where I pastored, and we do a lot of work presently in the Appalachians or in areas where there might be more poverty. And you'll run into people that might be missing teeth, or just their external look is different than what I grew up around. And they're as fearfully and wonderfully made as I am. And it's so important that I look into their eyes and I see them as, someone that God created and he placed in this particular place. And, as I get to know them, their leadership skills might be a 2 on a 1 to 10. Well, my job as a pastor is to help them become a 4, to stir up the gifts they have. And, it's not like I have somebody that has a PhD. It's, they're a blue collar worker, but they are someone that God wants to use within our particular community and within our church. And, the way you build leadership in them might be different than someone who comes from Fortune 500 company or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think I know where you're going with this, but you talk about taking somebody from a 2 to a 4, in terms of leadership skills, Steve. What does that look like to you?
Again, it's relational, and we have one community we've worked with for about 18 years, and one of their targets is working with the teenagers. And he does a summer program and he gives them job opportunities. The first thing he teaches them to be on time.
Yeah.
And for some of them, they've never cleaned a toilet. So, they go in and they just, and you start where people are at and then you build from there. One thing that really, I guess, surprised me, it shouldn't have, but it did, is you'll meet people that, didn't graduate from high school, but if they had grown up in a different home environment, they'd be a medical doctor. They're super bright. And a lot of times they're very intuitive. In at least the rural setting I was in, you had a lot of people that were very handy. And, just the stuff they could do, man, I have 2 left hands when it comes to that. It would just blow me away at, the way they could put stuff together.
Yeah.
Well, what I love there is you're also looking for the best in somebody as well, right? Like you're not looking for what's different than what you're expecting. You're actually like pulling out the best of what they have available, right? And I think that's a huge part of becoming a leader for them, right? Is knowing that there's somebody here who sees me for who I could be,
Yeah.
and for who God even sees me, right?
Yeah. And we're in the middle of nowhere, and right from the beginning in our church, we have people come in overalls, and it's before all the electronics. So we had people come with their vines and their strongs, and we were teaching our people to exegete scripture right from the beginning. You're like, man, you can't do that in a rural setting. Well, man, when we have guest speakers come in, they would, after church, the people would come up and go, "Hey, do you think that really was contextual in the way that was presented?"
Yeah.
And but part of that also taught people leadership, taught them
Yep.
discipline, and taught them that they could interpret scripture themselves. And we really challenged them to have a strong personal faith. And it wasn't just me to be the communitarian. It was, a lot of these people had lived there their whole lives,
Mm-hmm.
was to mobilize them to use their gifts and relationships to build God's kingdom. And, that was part of the leadership thing as well. A lot of them could, you know, I remember when I met superintendent of schools, it was somebody in the church who took me to meet with them because they knew the
Yep.
superintendent of schools
That's
when he
right.
was like 14 years of age.
Yep.
And so, all those things matter. Sports, at least in our area, was giant. Being involved in that, being involved in the parade. A lot of churches will have a float. Well, the community wants you to help organize the parade, help pay for it, have a float, and then be there to clean up afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I first started doing Rural Compassion, I met with a group of pastors in a small community. Unfortunately, they had 16 girls get pregnant out of wedlock. And as we conversed, it was like, if we had better teachers, if we had better parents, it was all this external blame. And as we talked, I said, well, as leaders, we don't look to blame. We look at what's going on, and then we ask God for wisdom on, what is it that we can do to make the situation better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the mentality of leadership, we need to have as a pastor. There's nothing that happens in your community that you're not responsible for. I'm not saying that you caused, but as a leader and as one chosen by God, he sent you there to be one that really brings God's kingdom. And bringing God's kingdom is bringing resolve and betterment to whatever that situation may be. And, every rural community is different.
Mm.
And, our placing and, the timing and the relationships are all unique. But for whatever reason, God called me to be there.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give it everything I have. And, C.S. Lewis said that if Christ had come and there was only one person to die for, he would have died for that one person. And, these small towns matter. And a lot of the pastors that we work with, they sacrifice at an incredibly high level in many different ways. And I admire them. I think as a church, as a whole in the United States, they should be our heroes. We need to honor them in ways that I really believe they deserve. And I appreciate Grove City just having a heart for the rural ministry. That is just there's so many areas you could put your energies, but to make this a priority, I admire you guys.
Mm. Well, I'll tell you, Steve, the feeling is mutual. We admire what you're doing. And I hope this is the first of many conversations on the podcast and just in person. I just really respect what you're doing and the way you do it. One last thing, as we kind of get toward the end today, I just want to make an observation that, everything you've said today, like, I already talked about this humility, but one of the things is like, I sense like you are actually trying to look for what God's doing in your community. You are trying to say, what is the Spirit of God up to here? And you also, part of that is like almost every story you've shared, whether it's teaching them how to interpret the Bible and people say, no, this can't happen. One of the things that doesn't happen in rural places as much as it should is people are taken seriously as people with amazing God-given potential. And that's what I hear over and over in these stories you're telling is you simply took the people seriously as people made in God's image, whether society had value to them or not. And lo and behold, leaders started to emerge when they got that kind of attention, when they got that kind of effort. And I think that is just a great place to end this conversation and actually, Garrett, push us toward the next one, because that kind of believing that God can do things in small places and in people that society has said, no, it can't happen here, is the first step I think a pastor has to have to actually see leaders develop. I mean, think about Acts when they're like, who are these fishermen? And then it's like, oh, they knew they had been with Jesus.
Wow.
Amen, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's all I got, Garrett.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah, I can't really think of a better way to wrap this episode. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. I mean, that it was great. Your heart really came through. Really, just thank you. And to everybody listening, we hope this conversation has been fruitful for you too. Hopefully it's given you some encouragement, insight, maybe even a practical idea for your own ministry context. The Rural Ministry Podcast is part of the good work being done at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College. If you found this helpful, there are a few free things you can do to help us out as well. First, you can share this episode with a friend or colleague who could benefit from it. Second, you can leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. This helps more people discover the show. And lastly, you can leave us a comment or suggestion on the episode page over at the Center for Rural Ministry YouTube channel. We hope to get some good conversation started over there as well. Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our mission by visiting www.ruralministry.org. Have a great week.